Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this, the 11th within the main cycle of the developer program, the 11th lesson. In fact, there we are. We have sat in on about 14 lessons so far, and this is about the component manager. We're going to be looking at the way in which we can take customizations from one system and apply it into another. And in my system, this is going to be largely a practical lesson. What you can see is that I have here an install of the Sage CRM, which is the one that I've been using regularly. I also have on my machine another install. So if I go up here and log on, I've got another install that has no customizations, but I want to be able to take the customizations that we prepare in one system and apply them in another system. And I want to do this in a structured, productized way. And I want to look at with you the whole process that we would go through, both as a developer creating something, an extension that we want to be able to deliver, and look at this from a system administration point of view. What do I need to think of if something is going to be delivered to me as a component? So we're going to look at all of these ideas. What is the component manager? How does it interact with the metadata tables? Because that's actually telling us some important stuff. We'll look at where we get help around the component manager and consider what is the scope of it. Remember, there's a theme that as we've gone through the different lessons that I've always talked about: what is the scope of references, what is the scope of effect. So there has actually got to be some controls about what the component manager can do. We'll look at the idea of the component manager not as simply a record and playback device, but actually something that is a tool set for a developer to be able to create components that are structured around what you want to do. So we'll give you an example of the component manager as a coding environment and the way in which we then deliver components in the real world, or at least a fairly realistic, simple way. Now, if I go back into CRM and I bounce across into the administration screens, and then, whoops, I'm not currently logged on. That's a bit of a blow. That's timed out. If I log on again, that's once we've logged on. I'm going to go to the administration screens. And within the administration screens, I want to have a look then at the licensing area, just to point out that you need to have certain licenses in order to be able to accomplish certain things. So we can see we've logged on, and I'm going to go into administration. I'm going to go into system and then down into the system license key details. So if we look here, we can see the license key, and the important thing on my machine is that you can see that I have both the Enterprise Integration Server license and the developer license. Now, we live in the real world where not everyone always works as a development partner on a machine which has a developer license. Sometimes you are creating and wanting to move customizations from one system to another system. The key thing is essentially everything that I'm covering in this particular lesson is designed really without needing to think too much about the idea that you can take things from one integration server, one system with an integration server license, and apply it to any other. And most installs around the world make use of the Enterprise Integration Server license within them. There are some places in which a standard version which lacks the Enterprise Integration Server license is installed, and the standard license you'll find can't actually create any of the new structures for themselves, but they could work with a component manager that delivers new screens, new lists, new so on. Now, I'm making the assumption here, of course, that you have used components. because we've used them throughout the course. I've used the idea that within the component manager we've played back and we've done a variety of things. So for example, if you remember back when we were talking about the new opportunity workflow, I ran and installed and then created in a new opportunity workflow using a component. I also did the same with the derived fields assistant when we were talking about the usage of custom fields within views, ones which carry out calculations or some data transformation tasks. And these derived fields assistant has parameters allowing us to insert information into the metadata, and this is a component. And so components are all around really our environment, and it's one of the chief ways in which we present teaching material inside the program. And so if you go into the partner community, if you go down into the downloads area, you will find, and here I can running down again, have a look down here, and you'll see there the developer downloads and components. So you've got lots of different example components that we're using nearly all the time. So you've got lots of these, including, you remember that one which allowed images to be displayed on the person's summary screen. So that's bulk of customizations. Now our ability to run those is fantastic. So that image one, for example, doesn't rely on an ASP page being added in. So we would know we'd be able to deliver that component into a system with a standard license. It gets a bit messy if we are using ASP pages which make use of the standard install files. If I switch over here, you can see I've been creating an ASP page, and you'll notice here that I'm making use of the Sage CRM include file, which includes here, well, let's go down to get those, the include file, both the Sage CRM.js, but also the Sage CRM nolang.js. Well, these files are responsible for the instantiation of the CRM object, as you can see down here, and there's a catch. That has to be instantiated in a particular way, and the license key is actually checked with that, and you'll find that you cannot use ASP pages that are the standard include files within, you cannot use them within a development project. You need to be able to supply either the developer include files in order for a standard license system to run. And those developer licenses, they're up on the they are up on the community to download as well, but you do get them when your company joins the developer program. But many people don't actually need to worry too much about them, because if you create your entity using the advanced customization wizard, you'd find actually that the advanced customization wizard creates its own include files as well. So if I go into where we've got www.root and then down into custom pages, you'll see here that it's dropped in the include files that the wizard created components like project, for example, make use of. Now those include files, I mention them because this becomes a mechanism of how on earth do I get files that I might need to reference into a component. It's going to be one of the challenges, and part of the purpose of this lesson is to say, well, let's actually always take stock of all of the different the files, include files, etc., that you're using, and we can make sure that we don't actually have to manually code for the inclusion of the files. It's something that we'll be able to manage in sort of an automatic way. But we should really start to look hard at how the component manager works. The component manager is sometimes imagined as a tool that allows us to basically record keystrokes that we carry out. Sometimes I hear it explained by colleagues as a sort of macroing tool, the idea that you record and you play back. It isn't that at all. So let's start to understand what's going on by doing a real world environment. Now I'm going to go into the component manager and I'm going to start the creation of a brand new component that is going to ultimately contain all the customizations associated with the delivery of a new extension of the product. Now the extension is going to be a very minor extension, but it's going to include an ASP page, an include file, and changes to the interface. Now, in order to do this, I need to create for myself a new component. And what I'm going to do this, I'm going to call this, let's call it training. And I'll call it training PM because we're in the afternoon. And I'll provide it with a description, and I will say add export to CSV training example. So this is my description of what this is going to do. Now the real world example we're going to do, you can probably tell from that, export to CSV, is going to be some sort of feature that will generate an export to a spreadsheet. And that's exactly what we're going to do. But there I have now indicated that any of the customizations that I do from this point on within the system are going to be recorded into this component. Strictly speaking, we'll see that it's not recorded into the component, rather those customizations are flagged as belonging to a particular component. But you'll notice here you've got some management things to allow us to stop the component manager working, to allow us to reset which component that we're using. We've got the possibility of working with multiple components, but you'd see as well with this preview script is that currently nothing is marked as belonging to training PM. But we'll see that this will soon change. What I want to do is I want to add in to the feature, so let's actually log on here as a salesperson. I'll log on as Matthew Ebden will do. If I log on as Matthew Ebden and I look at my opportunities in here, you can see I've got 19 opportunities. What I want is a button to appear here that when I press it, it's going to generate for me an automatic file to indicate that all those records have been written out into an Excel file, and it'll have been added into, depending on where I am, it'll have either added it into the shared documents, or if I do that export from the level of the company, then it will put it into the appropriate place. To do that, I need an ASP page which does the work, and I need to have a hook on which to put it. Well, I've written the ASP page before, so I need to go and add the hook, and this hook is going to be a button group associated with the opportunity list. So this is one of the ways in which we can add a customization to every single instance of the opportunity list. And what I'll do is I will call this Oppo list buttons. That's a good name, and I will look for the opportunity list system action. And in here I'll customize this and go and look for the idea of export to CSV using the custom file, and the custom file that I'm using is export to ASP. I'll just add that now into my button group. Now this is the file that I'm invoking, the export to Excel, and so you can see that it works on the basis of the include file in there. So if I have now added this, I save this, and we can test this with Matthew Ebden. If I now look at my listing of opportunities, we can see that I have in fact a new button here called export to CSV, and the pages work. So if I click on here, you can see that it's created for me an export of all of those records out into that spreadsheet file. The purpose of that is focused very much on the fact that I've created here a metadata structure and I've made a change. If I go into the database, so I have to open up the database first of all, we can go and look at what has happened here. If I log on, and navigate into the correct database, so I'm going to use Sage CRM 7.3, which is the database that I'm using, and then say select star from, and here it's custom underscore, I think I'll put screen objects. The last screen object that has been added in, we can see actually is the Oppo list buttons button group. Now if I narrow this down and say, well, let me actually see, there's a field in here called COBJ underscore component. So if I have a look at that field, we can also look for that field when it's not null. So where CObject is not null. So obviously it contains a value. If I go and look for that, we can see that our new row inside the screen objects area. Now screen objects are things like the header records for screens and lists and tab groups and button groups. We can see that we now have a new row in here that looks after that. And if I then follow it up by saying select star from custom tabs, and I'm going to be a little bit naughty here. I'm going to say select tabs underscore component start from custom tabs, where tabs component is not null. Tabs contains the information for the options within a tab or a tab group or a button group, and we can see here that we've got the details of the custom file that's being called from the system action opportunities list. So we've got those two rows of metadata that have been inserted, and you can see clearly that they belong to the component training PM. Now notice that this field only holds a single value, so that tells you any item of metadata can only belong to one component at any one time, which means you have to be very precise about defining what's in your component and what's not in your component, because when it comes to scripting, if someone else has come along with another component and touched on something before you've scripted it out, that customization will no longer be part of your component. But as it is, I've made this limited change, and a very good way of working when you are thinking about things is to say, well, I'm going to be very atomic about what my component contains. I'm going to be very, say, it's going to do this. And a lot of the work that I do is fairly narrow in creating point customizations. So if I go into my component manager, I can see within the component details now, if I click on preview script, I can look in at what it thinks it would have to write in the way of the code to create the customizations in the target system. Now this is the code that is generated to copy or to make the same change in another system. So it is not macroing, it is not recording keystrokes. What's happening here is that we make changes to the database gets labeled, and then when we ask for a component to be previewed or scripted, it reads all of the metadata tables to generate the code on the fly. So this has been, as I requested it, it's generated this. So it's not writing this code anywhere until I request it. Now, my ability to create the component, as I said, is either going to be quite narrow like this, or I could be quite generous. I could say I wanted to record everything. I wanted to create a component that represented all of the work that I did over a particular period of time. And within the advanced options, I have the ability here to create a component and actually select a span of other components to include within my own component. So I can force in components into my existing one. And I can also say I want all customizations between certain dates. So this would allow me, if I haven't actually thought about defining a component until towards the end of a particular period of customization, I can say, well, tell you what I want to do is I want to capture everything that I did in the last week, and this would allow me to start to do that. But as I said, I want to keep it nice and simple and constrained on a real world environment. Here we've got this file, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to script this out. So it's called Training PM, and it has a description. So I'm going to script the component out, and what you'll see is that it's created for me a file called trainingpm.ecf and a file called trainingpm.es. The first is a control file, so it's a parameter file, and the second one is the script file, and it's extensibility control file and an extensibility script file. And we can go and have a look at what these look like. Now you can use a basic text editor to do this, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm going off to look at my components, and I want to find my training pm.ecf file. If I open that up, let's change the font so that you can see them without too much difficulty, and I go to have a look at my training pm.in here, the ES file as well. So let's change that as well. So hopefully you can read these and they will start to be understandable to you. You can see in the parameter file we have a basic description, we have the directory information, and we also have the version. The directory information obviously points us to where the ES file is found, and so you can see there's the training pm.es file, and it's found in the training PM folder. The training pm.es file within the folder training PM contains a script that actually is run that performs the work. There's a particular structure to these files. And both of these files, I don't have to start by creating them, by recording them. You know, I could actually just create these from scratch. I can go ahead and write these just as text files because that's what they are. The idea is that it's a complete environment to allow us to perform the work that we want to do. Now, our starting to record the structure of the components, we saw that there is a particular structure in the include file that we've got, oh, sorry, the script file that we've got. You can see that it says script objects are added, then tab groups are added, and actually you can think of this as a logical way, because the screen objects, of course, are the header, and then the tab groups are the children of that. So these are the option, this is the option within the tab group or the button group that is created. And we can extend that still further, because if we have a very complex set of customizations, the overall settings is going to be the idea that, first of all, you add all of the database links in that you might have created, then you add in the tables, then you add in the views, and then you add in the columns. So there's a logical order. Now, sometimes there's a little bit of a roll through that you actually have to do. So you can notice that you've got the views and columns, and then fields appear later on. So you could argue, shouldn't the fields have come before the idea of the views? Well, yes, you could have done. But what happens is, in this logical order, when the components are processed by Sage CRM, they actually run through all of the scripts at least once, and so subsequently it runs all the scripts to make sure that there are no orphaned bits of code. If there are, there would be a problem in the execution of the code. But there is a general pattern that your components should look like because of the metadata dependencies inside the custom tables within CRM. Now, we started the process of creating our new component, and we've looked into the database to start to see how the metadata is labeled as belonging to the particular components. And so we've got to the point now we have created our ES and ECF file, and you might think that we're ready to go ahead and do the import, only we're not. One of the things that we have to start to do is to understand how we when a component is run, what we need to happen. Now, when it comes to running a component, and I want to consider this, is that we typically want metadata changes to take place, and we will also want files to be moved. So metadata and resources will be moved within the scope of the component. And if I run an example component, we can see that there may be more or less control passed to the component using the idea of parameters. Now, I'm going to go and run a component now which is going to make some metadata changes, but the principal idea is that I want to look at the way in which a file is moved and discuss a problem that we're going to face with our component that I'm actually constructing. So the first thing that I'm going to do, what I'm doing now is going into the component manager, and I'm going to find a component called import quick look. Now, amongst the download files that you'll see is this idea of a component to import the quick look DLL for Sage CRM 7.3. So I've brought this down, and I've added this component. I'm ready to run it. So it's not run yet, it's ready to run. If I look into the folder structures and run through here, and I look at INF folder, we can see that it's been unpacked, so it's ready to run on my machine, and we've got our import DLL, which we'll look at in the idea of parameters in a moment. But within the folder of import quick look DLL, you can see that there is a DLL file which also has to be moved. And the idea is, when we install this component, as the description tells us, it's going to move a DLL across and add this into the company tab to basically show it's a duplicate of the existing company quick look page. The purpose of this is to one, show how a quick look page can be rebuilt in the .NET DLL, and also to show how we would import a component. Now, as I do this, I'm also going to point out something to you. The first thing is that it's saying apply all changes. If we preview the install, this will tell us what it's going to be altering. Now, this could be a very wide range of things within the system, and it's doing a pre-parse to see if there's going to be any likely impact. So are there any records which have already been customized by a component that this could be overwriting? You might not want that. And you can see here that it includes the idea of copying a file, a deliberate copy of the file. Now, I said apply all changes, and so if I look at my components again and I look at that, and this time I say apply all changes no, and preview the install, it's going to look down to see if there is any clash. And in this case, no, there aren't, because I've not made any customizations to the company area at all within the system. Let's cancel that, and I will choose now my component. I'm going to apply all changes, and I'm going to install the component. Now, when you install the component, do you notice here it's saying refreshing views? So I've done something very profound. I have actually made a change, and because I've inserted new things, the standard behavior of the component manager is to drop the views and recreate them. Now, obviously, I'm working inside the system as a system administrator, but if there were other users in the system at the same time, I've just played merry hell with them, because I've actually dropped equivalent of a nuclear bomb on the views. They've all been dropped and they're all being rebuilt. And so you should not run a component, you should not install a component while there are users still within the system. So if I continue here, bang, we've got our system created, and what we can do now is we can prove that that has actually worked by jumping across, actually as one of my salespeople. If I go and have a look at one of my accounts as Matthew Ebden, so I'll look at my companies and jump across to 3G Homes, we should see that there's the new Quick Look tab, and if I click on new Quick Look, it's going to tell me there you go, I've got no communications, no opportunities, but I have got cases. And in fact, actually, that is the case. If I look at opportunities and communications, I've got none of those, but I have got cases. So it is reporting correctly. Well, you can see where it has added in the information. Well, that's good. And if I return now to the screen that we've got here, we can start to unpick what was inside that component. Components consist of a parameter file and they consist of a script file. In my example that I've just run, if I go to the Quick Look, we can see that the Quick Look file has got a series of parameters in addition to the simple 3 parameters that I had up here. In fact, these don't count. You know, these 3 things up at the top, they're just the header or the label for the component. The parameters are this information down here. Now, when we came to run this, we can see that that there are no choices that I'm making, but there are still parameters nevertheless. This is purely for information. So this is explaining to the user what's going on here. And if I now want to look at the script file, so go into my import and look into the script file, we can see within here, and I will explain the script or idea of scripting in a little bit, but essentially this is raw recorded material. But in addition, we're able to tell the user what's going on with messaging, and we can see that we've got additional information or additional behavior to copy the file that we saw here, which is the quick look into the location. Now, one of the interesting things about using the .NET API is that you do actually have to deliberately copy your files. And you can see that there's some environmental information to help us determine where we're going from and where we're going to in our installation. If that's the case, how does it work with ASP pages? Well, if we look in the ES file that it's generated, we'll see that there is no mention of copying a file. So within a input DLL, with this one, I actually had to use a method called copy file, but in my generated page, I don't have, there's no mention of it. One of the interesting things about the idea of the component manager is that it's clever enough to work out when a tab is referenced to see whether the tab uses the idea of the custom file. And if we have invoked custom file, it knows it will have to copy that file for itself. This is both a great thing and it's also a thing with limitations. So if we look at where I've got my training PM, I can see I've got a folder here called custom pages. And if I look inside here, you can see it's copied my export to Excel file. But, and this is the big but, it hasn't copied the include file that my ASP page depends on. So if you've got additional resources that your component needs to use, then you should carry out this trick. So I'm writing an extension really to the opportunity area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create now a dummy tab group. So I'm going to literally call it dummy oppo. But this tab group is not going to be used. Its purpose is to define additional metadata information and to provide the hook that will allow us to reference the external file. So if I type in export CSV here and use custom file again, this time I'm not referencing the ASP page. Instead, I want to reference the JS file. If I add that in place and I choose save, what you've got there is now an additional tab group. There's no mention to it. It's not going to be called anywhere within the interface. But if I now go back into the customization, I go into the component manager and into the component details, I can script out my component again so that my new version of this component, as we can see here, has been updated to include reference to my dummy oppo. Still, no mention whatsoever explicitly of the files that need to be copied, but we do have reference implicitly of them because it knows we're using the custom file action that copies files. Okay, hopefully I'm going to take a pause, see if anyone has got any questions so far about what I'm saying. Hopefully everyone is pretty cool with this. You're probably hanging on the edge of your seat wondering where we're going to go next. Well, where we're going to go next is start to think about our parameters, because we want to be able to control the operation of the component. Now, we can be very sophisticated in our control of components, and possibly the most sophisticated component that you'll use is the advanced customization wizard. So within the general customization area, within the component manager, we have this idea of the advanced customization wizard, that when we choose to install this, we're presented with a wide range of parameter names. Now, this is a component just like any component, and what we will find if we look in the screens is that we can go into our and here the name is suddenly slightly odd because it's actually called the main entity wizard. So if we open this up, and in here we will see all of the parameters. So we have parameters like entity name, entity column, and entity column prefix. So we have these names, and we can see that the parameters are of different types. So we'll explore that in a moment. But there we have parameters, and if we look to the include file, the ES file, the script file in here, and you can see there's an awful lot of files that need to be moved. So in our case, the ES file will also have quite a few movement responsibilities, moving these files, but you can see that we're able to read the parameter names by reference using the param method. Now I'm going to deliberately look at this idea in a second, but this is a very interesting idea. We've got the ability to define parameters. You can see here the way in which we define it, and then we are able to read parameters by using the param option. Okay, well, this is good. We're now at a point where we can think about defining we can now get to the point where we can think about our taking our parameters into the entity that I'm constructing, or sorry, the extension that I'm constructing. So to do that, coming back into the training pm.es file, we can start to think about how parameters can be introduced. We've looked that we've got parameters like this, where we enter in that control the creation of the entity, and we've seen that we also have parameters which are informational in nature. So that was the example of when we were using the import quick look. We can see the informational. I want to do both. I want to look in this example about how we do that. So let's start by thinking about parameters. Well, even before we do that, we should even think about something else, because how do I test this? How do I go about testing this page? Because if I look at what I've got my add export to CSV training example, but if I look at the components, I've got an earlier version, but I don't have the one that we're working on. So how come I don't see that? Well, this is because Sage CRM by default doesn't like the idea that a component can be installed more than once. And so that in a development environment, I'm presented with the expectation that I should take my component and apply it onto other system. But I'd have to keep reinstalling if I wanted to do that. But there's a flag that I can use within the parameters to allow multiple installs, and that is the multiple installs flag. If I go to the main entity wizard, you can see that I've used it straight there. And if you notice as well, error handling is set to be strict. And that error handling strict is a useful thing because it makes sure that if we make any metadata changes and there is an error, everything rolls back. So no permanent changes are made. So here I'm going to work with multiple installs. Yes, now that will have a very dramatic effect. If I look at my components and I click here, what we'll see is I now have in my list, I've got add export to CSV training example available. And so I could start the process of installing it. Now if I click on installing here, you can see that there's no parameter information found in this file yet. So this is where we start to add our parameters. So params, this is just a text file, but it is very useful to be able to do this. And if I look at the different types of fields, I'm essentially writing down here different entry types into the screen. Now, text, checkbox, multi-text, password, etc., all providing us with certain names that if I then switch back and see how they've been represented within this file, we can see that it's picking up these different variables, including our password, that inherit their native behavior. So if, for example, I've got an integer field and I put in a nonsense bit of text here rather than a number and try and install the component, these fields are clever enough to be able to return and interact with the CRM environment because it's processed through the EUDLL to validate. So there's inbuilt validation associated with these fields. We'll also see that that extent of validation can be further controlled by properties. And so I can look at a field and I can say, well, tell you what I want to do is I want to provide it with a default value, or I can start to change the nature of the field. The first thing to start though is the name, because look at that name. If I put in here comp name, CRM will look at that and it will say, I know that translation, and it will render that using the translations of the system. And so in my case now, by choosing the name of a field of a parameter, and I look to running that, you'll see that it's picked it up and says component company name. This is the technique that the file uses if we look at the behavior of the component for the derived fields assistant. You can see these fields: entity, entry type, column name, caption, entry width. These are not hard-coded names. If I look at that parameter file and go to the derived field, we can see that here the names that I'm using, culp entity, culp entry type, are the names which have translations within the system. And so they're all names of columns which I can then reference. And that's a pretty useful thing to be able to get hold of the caption that I want. Now, of course, I can change things if I want to. If I want to, I can override, and here you've got the ability to use a caption, as you can see here, like column name as the caption. And I've actually done belt and braces in this case. But I wouldn't have to do that. If I chose my column to be entry type, and I go back into where I have my ECF file and I change this field down here, the selection list, to be column culp entry type and choose save, we can see now, if I look at my components and I look down at my custom file, that file has turned and started to thought about the translation that we want to use. Well, actually it hasn't, but it's recognized the fact that it's a selection list. Probably a better one with a better translation would be actually comp underscore type. So let's do that, and go into customization, go into my component manager and run that again, or start running again I should say. And so at the bottom of the screen it's now saying type. Now it's wrong because the list is all too long, and so this is where other parameters need to come in. And so I can change its sizing. I can change its sizing to 1, and I can also change the translation group that it uses, which in this case would be the same name as the field, so comp type, for example, and I could make it give it a default value as well. So I could put in here, for example, supplier is the default value, and I could make it required. So I could do all of these, and now if I save this and I refresh this page, we can see that our type has been set. And in fact, even that it's a required field, I can indicate that that's the required field, leave it blank, and try now and install the component. It will tell me that it can't, it's invalid data, because down here I'm missing out. Well, can we do anything more sophisticated with our components, with our parameters? Because of course we can. You know, it's brilliant. What if we wanted to not use them for entering in simple text? What if we wanted to provide information to the user? Because one of the things about a file, if I just get rid of the parameters altogether for a moment and go back to where we had that parameter being run and the experience of it first time, that is a really bad experience for a customer. No parameter information found. So there's nothing to explain to the user what's expecting. And many people, when they see that, they think it's an error message when it's simply reporting fact. So how can we change this, change the experience? Well, what we can do is within our parameters, we can start to add in information which improves the experience. I'll just put in some of these, like the simple disclaimer and description of this file. And what we can start to see is some clever behavior. So if I refresh this now, what we can see is that I've got an image, and I've got a description, and I've got a disclaimer. So we've got the bare bones, if you like, of something quite nice. Now, how has this been accomplished? Well, it's accomplished because I've provided a name for the field, and by default it's laid out like a little header for a paragraph. You can see that it's marked as read only, and you can see that I've provided a default value. So it's assumed it's a text field with this information that's displayed. And if I just wrap this information, you can see as well that I can put in information that describes things. Now, you'll notice as I've written this, it's telling me that I can't use certain things. I can't use a comma in here because commas are used to indicate the separation of the different parameters. There are ways around that, and any of the characters that you use, we can see in here, we can cheat by using the idea of the special HTML characters to allow us to add in the parameter information that we want, or the use of, in this case, the comma. So you can see that it's reporting who this is. Now let's make this a really, this is sort of a real looking thing. So this is the description of what this component do. Well, what are we going to do here? This component will add a button export to CSV to all opportunity, so all lists created by the system action opportunity list. Now we can say this includes the My CRM and team menus. And we've got the disclaimer there, and we can see that we've got use of commas in here as well. So now this is starting to look fairly real. If I run this, and we can see that we have our image, we have our description, and we can space this in any way that we like, and we've got a disclaimer as well. The date's a bit wrong. We are, after all, not the 7th of November, but we are, what are we today? We are the 22nd of September 2015. And we've got the version correct of the software as well. Now, I want to take this idea a little bit further as well, because let's see about adding in a field that we want to pass in a value. It's very interesting that we've got a disclaimer, but how many people might actually just install this and say, I never saw the error message, I never saw the disclaimer, I don't believe you. Well, what if you wanted to make a positive action? So people, if they're installing this, they really need to consent. You want to capture their consent, a positive vote that they have understood this. The best thing that you can do is to put a little of a checkbox in saying that you actually can't progress until you've done that. And this is thinking about adding in a checkbox that is going to be a confirmation that you've actually accepted the conditions. So we can do that, and what I can do is I can add in a checkbox. And you can see that amongst the parameters that we've got, we have got a checkbox. And I can call this something like confirm conditions. And if I go back into my screen now, and look at this, we can see that there's a checkbox confirm conditions. Well, that title isn't particularly nice. I can get around it because I can put a space in here, but then I'd have to be very disciplined in remembering that when I capture the inbound information, I have to get the exact name right. And I don't particularly like using names like this. I would rather use the idea of a caption in my component file. I'd rather come in and be able to add in some additional information, and here, for example, I could call this Wibble. Just as a bear with me for putting in something silly like that, but it means that the caption is able to provide a translation that appears on the screen, but the field name would actually be something else, would be the original name value. So if I reload this page again, you can see here now that field is called Wibble. Now that's very good, and of course I can now decide to say please tick the box to accept the disclaimer. So I can put that in here, and in fact, this would work pretty well. But we've got that now appearing in here. So please check the box to accept the disclaimer. I don't need that final full stop. Imagine though I could do a little bit more. Now look, I've got in here caption displaying the image. Well, it doesn't just, this indicates that I can use this mechanism to inject any HTML that I like into the screen. So if I just drop in another box in here and this time put a caption in, and in my case I put in script and I type in window, well let's actually put not to window.alert, let's do CRM, well let's do window.alert first of all. Let's do window.alert, and if I type in hello world, we can see that I'm using a bit of good old plain old JavaScript to be able to communicate. So there's the hello world, and also the field that comes in. So I could improve this a little bit by deciding that I wanted that to be a read-only field. So read-only is true here, and what I could also do is change this from being a window.alert to being a CRM.info message. The significance of single and double quotes is not important at this stage. Both are perfectly allowable. And if I do this again, we can see that I've now used the client-side API inside the component page. This immediately starts to make you think, oh, you've got information about the current user here. So you can actually collect information about which user ran the component even. You've got all of that information being passed, and of course you could actually set values even while seeing them. So you can run scripts that put values into the page. Of course, that's very nice, and if we wanted to, if you like the idea of client-side JavaScript, you can even have the idea of on-change behavior being used. So in this case, if I put an on-change, I can just do a window.alert this value. And this is going to create a little text box, which if I type in here and tab off, you can see it pops up showing me the value. So I can do, this is a full sophisticated screen. This means, of course, what you could do is as people choose certain options on the screen, certain fields could be made visible or invisible. This is a very useful thing to do. Well, if I get rid of that, we are at the point where we do have our checkbox and we can start to think about what we do with this information. But before I sort of move to complete and move back into the scripting area rather than the parameter area, let's see if anyone's got any questions at this stage. No one is throwing out any questions just yet, which is fine. Let's get back into working on this. So I've got my component now with a nice front end. Let's start to think about what it needs to do. And so this is the scripting. We have we don't have to think about the movement of the files because they are ASP pages, so we're not having to use the deliberate mechanism. But what we might want to do is we might want to start putting some informational messages in here and also confirm, of course, that the user has checked the condition field. Now, this is the point where we need to start referencing the different methods of the component manager, and we should go to the community to make sure that we've accessed the developer guide. Now, what you'll find is that it's the 7.x developer guide. It's the latest version. You can see this, and you'd be able to download it, and there you can see that it's the Sage CRM developer guide. And if I look to where I've downloaded things in the past, I should be able to go into Adobe, and it doesn't kept that. Let's go into my custom pages and then into my downloads. So that's where my last download of those, and have a look at the Sage CRM 7.x. And we have a look at all the different PDFs that we've got in here. And we've got a developer guide. And we can see that this is the developer guide. And as I look down through the developer guide that I've downloaded from the community, through the chapters, there is a chapter on, or several areas on the usage of the component manager. Now, that's both from the operation of the component manager, but if we look down here as well, you can see that within the component manager, we can go ahead and we can start to create. I've gone down a bit too far on here. We can start to see that we've got the scripting examples and the component manager methods. So it's the component manager methods which provide us with the full sets of how do I do certain things, and they include everything from copying the files through to the environmental information. And you can see that environmental information would be very useful if we are wanting to know about the source folder, etc. So if I just look at the idea of installation information, you can see here I can get hold of the appropriate path. So working out where the DLL sits, where the installation sits. So you can find the whole the whole mechanism of where we're going. And you'd only really need that if you're building the path, as you can see in this file, where you're needing to use the method copy file in order to establish where am I reading from in order to where am I writing in. I'm more interested at this stage in the idea of providing some basic informational message to the users as they, or the system administrator, as they run the component. And so I'm going to use the idea of adding a message into the file. Now to do this, you can see that the method add message is easy enough to do, and you can see that you can format this with your own additional HTML. I'm going to keep things quite simple. I just want to use a very basic way of adding in information, and I'm going to use the idea of writing out progress. So I'm going to say here installation of components started, put in here button groups and tabs added. And in here, tab options added. And lastly, I'm going to say complete. So I've put some informational message in here, and that's fine. That'll work very nicely. But what I haven't added in is the check. I've used in here this confirm conditions field to ask my users to check the tick box to accept the disclaimer. So I need to know how to grab that. And to grab a parameter, I just use this param method. And so I can read my confirm conditions from the passed in variable confirm conditions. These other items I'm not interested in. I'm only dealing with the one bit of variable information. But I can confirm whether, and I can control whether or not my processing runs smoothly, or I can throw my own errors in. Basically, I can control that. And we know we've done this before elsewhere. We've looked at the idea of controlling when something is working or not working, when valid is true and when valid is false. And I can say if, and here the field that I want, if confirm conditions does not equal on, then valid is false. I can raise an error message, and I can add in here error string and the error string that I'm going to write out is going to be you have not consented, you have not confirmed an acceptance of the disclaimer. So in here I can say you cannot go on unless you have confirmed that. So I can test this because I changed in here multiple installs Y and error handling strict. I can actually test this for myself in this install before I pass it over to the other install. And so while I'm working inside CRM, I can now load this up. I can go into my nice component. Here you can see here I've read the instructions. I'm not going to choose the tick box, but instead I'm going to install my component. And you can see that it says due to the following errors, because I raised valid is equals false, none of the changes in this file have been implemented. You have not confirmed acceptance of the disclaimer. Brilliant. So I now have a way of forcing people to understand that this is making a profound change to their system. And if we run that again, we'll see that this works. So install the component, and here you can see I'm ticking the box, and I now run to install the component, and you'll see all of the informational messages coming up. So installation of component, buttons and groups, complete, bang, done. Very, very quick running of the script. The long thing is always the regeneration of the views and the metadata. Now once that's done, and we've done this, we can start to think onto the next stage, which is, of course, I've just installed that component. What if I didn't want to? What if I wanted to uninstall it? Well, here, if we had another hour or so, I would actually go through what we need to do. We have actually written quite a bit of this, and there is some very good examples on the community about how we design applications for how we design extensions for uninstallation. The first thing to realize is that if you really want to make it easy to uninstall, we have to accept that you're not going to be removing fields, not physical fields, and you're not going to be really altering screens which already have a proper existence. So it's very difficult to remove a component that has added fields into, say, the company table and then added them into an existing screen like company box long. What you can do with a component manager is you can remove fields and features from the interface. So you can remove tab options, you can remove you can remove button group options. So something which had a separate navigational option, then you can remove. And a good example of that is within the marketplace. If you go into the marketplace and you look at the CRM downloads, you'll see that you've got the Twitter add-on. Now, I've already downloaded the Twitter add-on. If I go to the component manager and run through the screen, you can see that I've got the install uninstall Twitter add-on, and if I look to that, you can see that there's a checkbox to uninstall the Twitter component. With a little bit of examination, you can go in and find how the parameter is referenced. And so in this case, if we look in Twitter and then look at the twitter.es file, what we'll find is that there's a way of retrieving the value of the install or uninstall option. So let's do that. You can see that in here, the param is seeing what the person chose, and then you could follow that through to see what happens if do uninstall is actually set. So there's a lot of objects in here about how to carry out the uninstallation. So we've covered the creation of the component. We've covered actually the running from the experience of how we add in parameters, etc. We've looked at the idea of previewing, and we've thought about the behavior of the component, and we've certainly gone in and we've edited scripts. We've looked at parameters and passing parameters. What we need to do now is to see whether actually the component that I've created here neatly in this example can be picked up and applied into the other system. And so off we go into my file system, and I need to go into where I've got my CRM installed, which of course I forgot where it was then. Then we go into Sage CRM, CRM73, down into INF, and the file that I'm interested in is training PM and training PM. So I want the folder and I want the parameter file. So here I've just selected both of those. If you see that I've selected both of those, I'm going to right mouse click and I'm going to send to the zip file. So I've just made that a zip file, and I'll copy that up onto my desktop. So I've just copied that file up onto my desktop. So if I go back into my other install of CRM, and this is not my other install, I want to go to now ERPX3, and I want to log on. So I'm logging on as a system administrator here. System's starting up. Now this system doesn't have any metadata customizations. It's only got customizations that have been added in using the client-side API in an external file. That's something that I would refer you back to some of the earlier lessons within the cycle of training. But I can now go to the administration screens and go into customization, where I've got the component manager. Now I don't have my component that's in here. I can go and choose up on my desktop the training pm.zip, and I can upload that. And so you can see that we now actually have the add export to CSV training example. And if we install the component, and I choose to install the component, oh, I've got a checkbox. There we are, look, it's even brought across the nice disclaimer, and that would work, but I'm going to click that and now install my component. You can see that it's running through all the errors, all the information messages, no errors. It's told me it's done everything neatly. It's refreshing the views. And we can continue there. So we've done that, it's worked, and if I look at my CRM, or better still, let's go to a company. Let's go and find a company like Eurolandia. So I look at Eurolandia. On Eurolandia, there is a opportunities tab. We see there are some opportunities in here. We've also got an export to CSV file. We click on that and we can see that it's created it, and that has actually gone ahead and created that file for export and added it to the appropriate library. So it's done everything it was doing, and if we now need to start to summarize this, we can think about what I've gone through at this point. You have to be careful when working with the component manager, because the component manager can only supports the idea of a single item of metadata belonging to a single component. So if you alter a screen like or a structure like a tab group or a list or a screen, then all of the fields inside that also get changed, and they'd also be moved into that component. So you just have to be very aware that in changing a tab or a screen, you change all of the individual child records as well, because of course they have a relationship with each other, like their order in those as well. If you are installing, really you should, installing a component, you should really lock users out of the system before installing it. Otherwise you run the risk, as I said, of creating an error. And there's no natural uninstall, but there are techniques that you can use. You can design a component from scratch so that it's easier to remove from the interface, and there are mechanisms for you to do that. Otherwise you're in the business of basically methodically going through and undoing the metadata changes that component created. We've got some do's and we've got some don'ts. Most of them are very easy to understand. The don'ts are probably the headlines, in the sense that be discreet about what you're creating. Think about what the scope of what is included and not included within the component, so that you decide when you should stop recording or labeling items as belonging to your component. And don't forget that the component manager includes all of the metadata tables, including workflows, saved searches and reports. And make sure that if you're doing things like this, that you comment, because it's horrible working with a component that says there is no parameter information. It creates a certain sense of anxieties. Everything else, I think, within the do's, I've itemized there. We've gone, they're fairly logical as to what you can do there. Let's see if there are now any questions about what we've covered.